Something shifted long before anyone could point to a moment or a reason. There was no announcement, no dramatic break, no visible rebellion, just a subtle internal divergence, a point where your mind stopped following the grooves it had been trained to move through and began tracing its own lines instead. At first, nothing around you appeared different, but you could feel it in the way explanations started sounding rehearsed, in the way certainty felt brittle instead of solid, in the way authority relied more on repetition than understanding. You didn't reject what you were taught outright. You examined it. You didn't decide to rebel. You noticed inconsistencies, and that was enough. Because the moment someone begins to notice rather than absorb, the old version of reality doesn't gradually dissolve. It destabilizes. The assumptions that once held your world together lose their grip. The roles you were expected to play no longer fit. The language that once defined legitimacy starts sounding hollow. And the strangest part is that the people around you sense this before you ever spoke it aloud, responding not to your words, but to the quiet recalibration happening behind your eyes. Systems are attuned to deviation. Now pause. The ones who relied on their titles now hide behind tone and posture because you crossed a threshold they never planned for. And the strangest part is you felt it before you could explain it. That internal shift where the air around you felt different, where familiar spaces no longer responded the same way, where admiration quietly turned into distance, politeness replaced warmth, and those strained smiles began appearing, the kind that signal recognition without acceptance. Because what changed wasn't your behavior, it was your frequency, and people instinctively react when they sense something awake in front of them that they can't predict, manage, or redirect, because you became the unintended consequence of a system designed to produce obedience, someone who listened too closely, noticed too much, and refused to unsee what became obvious. And once that happened, once the illusion cracked, the so-called custodians of knowledge felt it immediately. Those who define themselves by being the final authority. The ones whose self-worth depends on standing above others intellectually because you didn't arrive through their channels, didn't inherit their language, didn't internalize their assumptions, and yet you reached conclusions that took them years to approach. Not by memorization, but by synthesis. Not by permission, but by pattern recognition. And that's what destabilized them, because the real threat was never disagreement. It was independence. And when you stopped seeking validation from the structures that once defined legitimacy, your thinking expanded into territory they'd fenced off with jargon, credentials, and artificial complexity, revealing something they've always known but never wanted exposed. That knowledge is fragmented not because reality is complicated, but because control requires separation. Because when people are taught to isolate disciplines, to keep history away from psychology, economics away from biology, politics away from behavior, they stop seeing the machinery beneath the surface. And you, without formal initiation, saw the machinery. Noticed how the same incentives repeat across systems, how power recycles its tactics, how narratives follow identical blueprints regardless of context, and you didn't announce it, didn't posture, didn't claim authority. You simply spoke plainly, and every time you did, something subtle happened. Conversation stalled, rooms quieted, eyes shifted because you articulated what others sensed but couldn't frame. And the moment you realized that clarity made people uncomfortable, you understood that this wasn't about intelligence. It was about disruption, because history doesn't change when institutions evolve. It changes when individuals notice what institutions depend on staying invisible, and every major shift in thought began the same way. Not with applause or permission, but with discomfort, isolation, and quiet resistance. With someone asking a question that wasn't on the syllabus, connecting elements that weren't meant to be aligned, and refusing to abandon the insight once it appeared. And those people were never celebrated early. They were labeled, dismissed, minimized. Because systems don't fear wrong answers, they fear unauthorized understanding. And you stepped into that role unintentionally, noticing how the world began responding differently the moment you stopped diluting your observations, wondering why certain people grew defensive, why others tried to steer you back toward safer conclusions. Why encouragement subtly turned into correction? Because you weren't challenging opinions. You were challenging frameworks, and frameworks are where power hides, and it didn't feel dramatic at first. It felt like a click, a quiet internal alignment where information stopped feeling scattered and started behaving like a living network, where topics once treated as separate revealed shared structures, where randomness gave way to pattern, and that was the moment you crossed from participant to variable, from consumer of narratives to observer of mechanisms. And once that happened, containment became the priority, because labels are the first line of defense, followed by noise, followed by credential shaming, all attempts to pull you back into a controlled lane, to remind you that understanding without authorization is dangerous, but reality doesn't obey credentials. It responds to perception, and your perception had already recalibrated, allowing you to reason without asking whether you were allowed to, and the irony is, you weren't trying to dismantle anything. You were simply honest, simply attentive, simply unwilling to pretend ignorance for comfort, and that honesty exposed the fragility of structures that rely on mystique, because when you speak plainly about complex things, you remove the illusion that complexity equals depth, and that's when the system starts glitching. Not loudly at first, but subtly, through dismissive phrases that replace explanation, through appeals to authority that mask insecurity, through exaggerated critiques of minor errors meant to distract from larger truths, because when logic can't be refuted, the person using it must be discredited, and you watch this play out repeatedly, noticing how credentials became shields, how tone replaced substance, how complexity was weaponized to obscure simplicity, because simplicity threatens hierarchy, and the more calmly you connected ideas, the more agitated the responses became, because agitation is what happens when illusion is confronted by coherence. And you realize that education, as they define it, isn't about expanding awareness, but about narrowing acceptable conclusions, about specialization that prevents synthesis, about expertise that protects its borders, and you violated that unspoken rule by thinking across boundaries, by recognizing that systems share skeletons, that incentives shape behavior more than ideology, that control operates through fragmentation. And once you saw that, you couldn't unsee it because awareness rewires perception permanently, making manipulation obvious, making narratives transparent, making authority conditional rather than absolute. And that's when you understood why their reactions felt personal, because they were. Because your clarity threatened their investment in confusion, and every time you spoke, you illuminated something they depended on staying dim. Every time you connected dots, you exposed motives embedded in structure, and while they pretended calm, internally they scrambled because they knew what you'd touched, not facts but patterns, not information but architecture. And architecture is harder to defend, because once someone sees the blueprint, the illusion collapses, and that's why the system responds the same way every time. First dismissal, then complexity, then credential attacks, then character judgments, because it isn't designed to engage with someone who sees from above. There comes a phase in a person's life that doesn't announce itself with noise or drama, but with a subtle internal disobedience, a quiet refusal to keep agreeing with things that no longer resonate. And at first it feels confusing because nothing on the outside has changed, yet everything on the inside has shifted. The way you listen changes. The way you respond changes. The way silence suddenly feels heavier than words, and you begin to realize that the exhaustion you've been carrying wasn't from effort, but from pretending to accept narratives that never sat right in your spirit, pretending to move at a pace designed for people who aren't wired like you, pretending to respect authority that confuses control with wisdom, and once this realization takes root, it does not reverse, because awareness does not unsee itself, and that is when the separation begins. Not a dramatic split from people or places, but an internal uncoupling from old agreements you didn't even remember signing. Agreements that said you must stay small to be accepted, that said questioning too much is dangerous, that said truth must always come from above rather than from within. And as these agreements dissolve, you start noticing patterns that were always there, but somehow invisible, like how certain conversations shut down the moment they get too close to truth, How some people rely on complexity to maintain importance, how fear often disguises itself as professionalism or tradition, and you don't become angry about it at first. You become curious, and curiosity is what changes everything, because curiosity is not rebellious, but it is uncontrollable. And once curiosity wakes up, it begins connecting dots across time, memory, behavior, systems, and motives. And you realize that much of what you were taught to admire was actually built to prevent this exact moment. The moment when an individual stops outsourcing their thinking and begins trusting their own perception. And this is why the shift feels lonely even when you are surrounded by people. Because you are no longer fully participating in the collective trance. You are present, but not absorbed, engaged, but not obedient, listening but not hypnotized. And that difference is felt by others even if they cannot articulate it, because energy recognizes divergence before language does. And this is when dynamics change subtly, when jokes land differently, when certain people feel challenged without you ever challenging them, when your silence is interpreted as judgment, when your questions are labeled disruptive even when they are sincere, because you are no longer reinforcing the shared illusion that keeps things comfortable. And comfort is often valued more than truth, especially in systems that depend on predictability. But your mind has begun moving in a different direction, not upward or downward, but inward and outward simultaneously, inward toward clarity and outward toward pattern recognition. And you notice how often power structures rely on distraction, urgency, or emotional reactivity to keep people from pausing long enough to think, and the more you observe, the calmer you become. Because clarity does not shout, it steadies. And this calm is unsettling to environments built on chaos or fear, because calm people are harder to manipulate, harder to rush, harder to scare into compliance. And so you may notice subtle resistance forming around you, not always hostile but defensive, people over-explaining things you didn't ask about, asserting credentials unnecessarily, repeating slogans instead of engaging with substance. And none of this is accidental, because when someone steps outside the script without announcing it, the system notices, and the system's first response is always to normalize you back into place, to gently remind you of roles, expectations, and limits, to reframe your insights as naivete or coincidence, to suggest you are thinking too much instead of seeing too clearly. And if that doesn't work, the tone shifts. Because systems rarely ask why someone sees differently. They ask how to stop it. But here is the part they never anticipate. Once a person understands how their own perception was shaped, controlled, and redirected, they cannot unknow it, and control loses its grip. Not through force, but through irrelevance. Because you stop reacting the way you're supposed to. You stop feeding energy into manufactured conflicts. You stop needing validation from structures that once defined success for you. And this doesn't make you superior. It makes you free. And freedom is deeply disruptive to environments built on dependence, because dependence requires belief in external authority, while freedom grows from internal alignment. And as you align more deeply with your own discernment, you begin noticing how often truth is simple, but intentionally buried under layers of noise. How solutions are obvious but ignored because they threaten existing hierarchies. How intelligence is measured by memorization rather than insight. And you see how many people are rewarded not for understanding, but for maintaining confusion. And this realization does not make you bitter. It makes you patient. Because patience comes from seeing the whole board, rather than reacting to individual moves. And patience is another trait systems cannot easily predict or control, because patient people are not desperate, not impulsive, not easily baited. And you may feel the urge to explain what you're seeing, to wake others up. But you quickly learn that awareness cannot be transferred by force. It has to be invited by readiness. And so you learn restraint, not silence, but discernment, knowing when to speak and when to let reality teach on your behalf, because reality is far more persuasive than argument. And as time passes, you begin to trust timing more than urgency, process more than performance, alignment more than approval, and this trust rewires how you move through the world. You stop chasing outcomes and start honoring integrity. You stop proving yourself and start embodying clarity. And this embodiment does something profound. It destabilizes false authority without confrontation. Because when someone lives in quiet alignment, they expose how much effort others are using to maintain appearances. And this exposure is uncomfortable, because it reveals the cost of living disconnected from truth, the exhaustion of performing certainty without understanding, the fragility of identities built on titles rather than substance. And while some will feel threatened by this, others will feel drawn to it. Not to you personally, but to the permission your presence gives them to trust themselves. And this is where responsibility enters. Not responsibility to save or lead, but responsibility to remain honest, grounded, and compassionate, because clarity without compassion becomes arrogance, and awareness without humility becomes another form of control. And you are not here to replace one hierarchy with another. You are here to demonstrate a different way of being, one rooted in self-trust, curiosity, and ethical perception. And this path is not glamorous. It is quiet, often misunderstood, sometimes isolating, but deeply stabilizing, because it aligns you with something unshakable, your own inner compass. And when you move from that place, you stop fearing rejection, because you are no longer abandoning yourself to belong. You stop fearing loss because you are no longer building your identity on things that can be taken. And this is when life begins to feel less like a test and more like a dialogue, less like survival and more like participation. And even challenges take on a different texture, not as punishments, but as information, feedback from reality guiding refinement rather than correction. And you realize that growth was never about becoming someone else. It was about remembering who you were before conditioning taught you to doubt your perception. And this remembering is not dramatic, it is subtle. It shows up as peace where anxiety used to live, as clarity where confusion once dominated, as discernment where fear once ruled. And the more you settle into this state, the less you need to announce it. Because truth does not require advertising. It resonates quietly and persistently, influencing through consistency rather than persuasion. And if you ever wonder why this path feels demanding yet deeply right, it is because alignment requires integrity, and integrity requires letting go of comfort built on illusion. But what you gain in return is coherence, a sense that your thoughts, actions, and values are no longer at war, and that inner coherence becomes your anchor in a world that profits from fragmentation. And as you continue forward, remember this: not everyone is meant to understand you. Not every space is meant to hold you. Not every system is meant to support clarity. And that is okay, because your role is not to fit, but to function authentically, to remain awake without becoming hardened, to remain clear without becoming cruel, to remain discerning without becoming detached. And if at times you feel tired, remember that you are not carrying the weight of the world. You are simply refusing to sleep through it. And that awareness, grounded in humility and guided by compassion, is enough. Let us enter a deeper prayer now, one that stretches beyond words and settles into the quiet places where true transformation happens, asking God, source of all wisdom and order, to steady our minds when insight comes too fast and the world feels too loud, to soften our hearts so that clarity never turns into arrogance and understanding never becomes isolation. to remind us that seeing more does not mean standing above, but standing rooted, compassionate, and responsible, to place a guard over our thoughts so we do not weaponize truth or rush ahead of grace, to teach us when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to wait, to strengthen us against fear-based reactions from others and keep us from internalizing resistance as rejection, to bless us with patience when growth feels lonely, courage when integrity costs comfort, and peace when the path ahead feels uncertain, to help us remember that awakening is not an end point, but a stewardship, that knowledge is not ownership, but trust, and that every layer revealed comes with a call to love more deeply, forgive more freely, and walk more gently through a world still learning how to see. And may our steps be aligned, our discernment protected, our ego dissolved where it interferes, our purpose clarified without strain, and our spirit anchored in humility, resilience, and quiet confidence, knowing that what is divinely guided does not need force, defense, or validation, only faith, consistency, and surrender. And if this message felt less like information and more like recognition, if it mirrored something already unfolding within you, rather than trying to convince you of anything, then stay connected here by liking and subscribing to Rise and Shine, where awakening is approached with balance, depth, and grounding, where insight is paired with responsibility, and where we continue this journey together, without rush, without fear, and without losing our humanity along the way.